Hello everyone, my name is Dalton Jenkins, and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on chapter 45 of our textbook, which is titled Hormones and the Endocrine System. Hormones bind to target receptors and trigger responses. First off, what is a hormone? Hormones are molecules found within the bodies of animals that serve to elicit some specific response from cells that possess a specific target receptor to which the hormone is able to bind. Let's talk about the concept of intercellular information flow, starting with the concept of endocrine signaling. Endocrine signaling refers to the processes through which hormones travel through bodily fluids, stimulate responses to outside stimuli, maintain homeostasis, and control growth and development. We can talk about paracrine and autocrine signaling. Local regulators are signaling molecules secreted by some cells that do not travel very far throughout the body. Instead, they act on target cells that are reachable by diffusion alone in the immediate area in a process known as paracrine signaling. Or local regulators can also act directly on the cell that secreted them in a process known as autocrine signaling. Talk about synaptic and neuroendocrine signaling. Neurotransmitters are signaling molecules that stimulate local target cells by diffusing very short distances and are secreted by synapses, which are the regions that connect neurons together. Neurohormones are specialized signaling molecules that are produced by neurosecretory cells, a kind of specialized neuron, and enter the bloodstream after diffusing out of the ends of nerve cells to carry out the process known as neuroendocrine signaling. Talk about some cellular hormone response pathways. First, we'll talk about water-soluble hormones. Water-soluble hormones are unable to diffuse across cell membranes because they are insoluble in lipids, so they target receptor proteins located on the surfaces of target cells. You can see I have a diagram here. This is the secretory cell. It's secreting a water-soluble hormone. The water-soluble hormone attaches to a receptor on the outside of the cell because it cannot diffuse through the membrane because it is not lipid-soluble. Next, we'll talk about lipid-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble proteins are able to diffuse across cell walls, which is how they enter the bloodstream before binding to transport proteins that allow them to circulate in the blood, where they will find target cells, diffuse across their membranes, and target receptor proteins located within the cytoplasm or nuclei of target cells. So here in this diagram, we have a lipid-soluble hormone. This is the secretory cell. It's being transported through the blood. It reaches a target cell, diffuses across the membrane, and attaches to a receptor protein, in this case in the nucleus. Signal transduction refers to the cascading series of events through which chemical signals from outside of the target cell are translated into a specific response that occurs within a target cell. Let's talk about response pathways for lipid-soluble hormones. When a lipid-soluble hormone binds to a receptor protein inside of a target cell, the intracellular response, typically a change in gene expression, is triggered immediately. Most receptor proteins that bind to lipid-soluble hormones are located within the cytosol of a target cell before binding to the hormone, after which the receptor hormone complex formed by this bond moves into the cell's nucleus and alters the transcription of specific genes. And lastly on this slide, we'll talk about endocrine tissues and organs. Endocrine cells are found throughout the body and organ systems besides the endocrine system, and endocrine glands such as the thyroid glands, testes, and ovaries are organs found within the bodies of animals that do not have ducts and are capable of secreting hormones directly into the fluids that surround them. Let's talk about feedback regulation and the nervous system. First, we'll talk about simple endocrine pathways. In simple endocrine pathways, endocrine cells secrete a specific hormone in response to a specific stimuli, which travels to a target cell and binds with a suitable receptor protein and elicits an intracellular response through signal transduction. Here I have a diagram of a simple endocrine pathway. You see the stimulus causes the endocrine cell to secrete hormones, which circulate through the body via blood, bind to target cells, and elicit a response in a negative feedback loop that reduces the stimulus. Now we can talk about simple neuroendocrine pathways. Simple neuroendocrine pathways function similarly to simple endocrine pathways. However, instead of endocrine tissue receiving a stimulus, a sensory neuron receives the stimulus and in turn stimulates a neurosecretory cell to produce a neurohormone, which diffuses into the bloodstream to find target cells on which it can act. Moving on to feedback regulation. First, let's discuss what negative and positive feedback are. Negative feedback is a feedback control mechanism that is more commonly exhibited by the homeostatic processes in animals than positive feedback is, and it involves responses that will reduce stimuli rather than amplify them. Whereas positive feedback is a feedback control mechanism that is less commonly exhibited by the homeostatic processes in animals, and it involves responses that will amplify the stimuli rather than reduce them. Moving on to the coordination of the endocrine and nervous systems. The hypothalamus is a region found within the brains of vertebrates that controls homeostatic processes and the coordination of endocrine system and nervous system activities by receiving signals from the body's nervous system and responding with neuroendocrine signaling. The pituitary gland, which is an endocrine gland found at the base of the hypothalamus, consists of two smaller glands or lobes known as the posterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland acts as an extension of the neural tissue of the hypothalamus, and the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes hormones only in response to those released by the hypothalamus itself. Let's talk about posterior pituitary hormones. The posterior pituitary gland produces ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, and stores them to be released in response to specific signals from the body's nervous system. What is ADH? Vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, is a hormone present in the kidney that responds to high blood osmolarity and results in the formation of extra-aquaporin channels, thus increasing the amount of water reclaimed. Oxytocin, on the other hand, controls many reproductive processes, such as milk production in the mammary glands of female mammals, uterine contractions during birth, and behaviors like libido, pair bonding, and maternal instincts. Moving on to anterior pituitary hormones. Anterior pituitary hormones are only secreted in response to hormones produced by the hypothalamus and control many diverse functions throughout the body, and many of them regulate other endocrine glands and tissues. These hormones released by the hypothalamus that control the release of anterior pituitary hormones are known as releasing or inhibiting hormones. Every anterior pituitary hormone is controlled by at least one releasing hormone, and some have a releasing and an inhibiting hormone associated with them. Moving on to thyroid regulation, the thyroid gland, which is an endocrine organ, is split into two distinct lobes that are found on the ventral surface of the trachea. A hormone cascade pathway beginning with thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, which plays a role in regulating the body's energetics, reproductive processes, and maintaining normal blood pressure. Hormonal regulation of growth. The anterior pituitary gland controls the body's growth and development processes through the release of growth hormone, which has many targets including the liver, where it stimulates the release of insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs, that stimulate the growth of bones and cartilage. Too much growth hormone in juveniles can result in gigantism, and too much growth hormone in adults can result in acromegaly, while too little growth hormone in childhood can result in pituitary dwarfism. Moving on to endocrine glands and their roles in homeostasis. First, let's talk about parathyroid hormone and vitamin D and how they control blood calcium levels. Calcium ions are vital for cell function, thus the blood's levels of calcium ions must be regulated through homeostatic processes. An excessive concentration of calcium ions can lead to organ damage due to the formation of calcium phosphate precipitates in body tissues, and a concentration of calcium ions that is too low can result in convulsions of skeletal muscles that can eventually lead to death if not treated. Mammals have 4 parathyroid glands located on the thyroid that serve to regulate the concentration of calcium ions in the bloodstream through the release of parathyroid hormone in response to a drop in calcium ion levels. Parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcium ions into the bloodstream from bones and stimulates the kidneys to increase calcium ion reabsorption in the renal tubules. Furthermore, parathyroid hormone promotes the production of vitamin D, which promotes the absorption of calcium ions from food in the intestines. As calcium ion concentration in the blood rises, a negative feedback loop will prevent the further secretion of parathyroid hormone. And the thyroid glands of mammals release a hormone known as calcitonin in response to excessive levels of calcium ions in the bloodstream. And calcitonin prevents the continued release of calcium ions by bones and increases the rate of calcium ion excretion in the kidneys. Moving on to adrenal hormones and how they respond to stress. In vertebrates, the adrenal glands are endocrine organs located on top of each kidney that regulate the body's homeostatic responses to stress through the release of hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Furthermore, each adrenal gland is a fusion of an endocrine gland, known as the adrenal cortex, and a neuroendocrine gland, the adrenal medulla, similar to the pituitary gland. Let's talk about the adrenal hormones and how they respond to stress. In vertebrates, the adrenal glands are endocrine organs located on top of each kidney that regulate the body's homeostatic responses to stress through the release of hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Furthermore, each adrenal gland is a fusion of an endocrine gland, the adrenal cortex, and a neuroendocrine gland, the adrenal medulla, similarly to the pituitary gland. First, let's talk about the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla releases catecholamines, such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, that increase the amount of fuel available for use by the body by stimulating the release of glucose and fatty acids and the breakdown of glycogen by the liver and skeletal muscles. Catecholamines also influence heart rate, bronchiole dilation, vasodilation, and vasoconstriction to increase the amount of oxygen available to the heart, brain, and skeletal muscles when faced with a state of stress. Let's look further into the effects of epinephrine. Epinephrine binds to receptors in liver cells, which results in the activation of kinase A, a protein that controls enzymes involved in glycogen metabolism, and the final result is the release of glucose into the blood. Epinephrine binds to receptors in the smooth muscle cells found lining the blood vessels that supply skeletal muscles, and this induces a relaxing effect on the blood vessel that increases blood flow to the skeletal muscles. Epinephrine binds to receptors in the smooth muscle cells found lining the blood vessels that supply the intestines as well, and this induces vasoconstriction to reduce blood flow to the intestines and increase the amount of blood available for the skeletal muscles. Moving on to the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is activated by stresses including abnormal levels of blood sugar or blood pressure, which can trigger the hypothalamus to release a hormone that stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, that stimulates the production of corticosteroids in the adrenal cortex. There are two main types of corticosteroids produced in humans. Glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, increase the amount of fuel available to the body by promoting the synthesis of glucose from sources that are not carbohydrates, such as proteins, and by stimulating the breakdown of muscle proteins into amino acids that are then converted into glucose in the liver and kidneys. The other type is mineralocorticoids, such as aldosterone. They mainly serve to facilitate osmoregulation in humans. Move on to sex hormones. Male sex hormones, also known as androgens and including testosterone, are primarily produced by the testes and facilitate the development of male reproductive structures in male embryos and the development of male secondary sex characteristics during puberty, whereas estrogens, such as estradiol, are female sex hormones primarily produced by the ovaries that facilitate the growth and production of female secondary sex characteristics during puberty and maintain the female reproductive system. And the last point I want to talk about is hormones and biological rhythms. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland positioned close to the center of the brains of mammals that produces a hormone known as melatonin, which plays a role in regulating biological rhythms related to reproduction, sleep, and daily activities. Melatonin secretion increases at night, and more is released when the nights are longer. The release of melatonin is regulated by a group of neurons known as the suprachiasmatic nuclei, or SCN, that are stimulated by light-sensitive neurons in the retina. I have a diagram showing how parathyroid hormone and vitamin D regulate blood calcium levels. So we start with normal blood calcium levels. The levels fall. Parathyroid glands are stimulated to release parathyroid hormone. In the bones, parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcium ions. In the kidney, parathyroid hormone stimulates calcium ion reabsorption from filtrate and promotes activation of vitamin D. In the intestines, active vitamin D increases the calcium ion absorption from food into the bloodstream, and the blood calcium level rises back to normal. And that is all I have for today. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.